not going to be specifically about covering elections or covering campaigns. We're going to really talk more about covering government. And I invited Matt specifically because he's part of the team that won the Everett McKinley Dirksen Award for coverage of Congress, which the National Press Foundation awards every year. And that's part of the big awards dinner that we have, which this year you all will be invited to. At no cost. You get a complimentary ticket because you're a Paul Miller Fellow. And actually, if you have your phone with you right now, you can save the date because we've recently set the date for the upcoming dinner, which is February 27th. So can somebody just double check on that?
February 18th.
Yeah, so we're going to check on the date, but you should save the date because it's an important dinner. It's a great chance to network and watch. Wasn't it a fun dinner?
It was.
And it would have been fun even if you hadn't been a winner, right?
Slightly less fun, but still fun.
Okay. So Matt is a reporter here in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe. He currently covers the White House and national politics. He's written about bunches of stuff. John Kerry's first trip abroad, Senator Ted Cruz's years at Harvard. I love the gallery in rural Kansas that honors the losers of presidential elections. He was part of the team that wrote this Broken City series of stories that really looked at Congress and why it wasn't working. And one of the things that I think our Dirksen judges really liked about this series was the fact that it was very accessible for people who aren't covering this every day. It really, I think, laid things out in a way that was a great example of storytelling. And so we've invited Matt to come in and talk about the series they did and how they did it. And so thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to see Kim here. Also, I think she was in our bureau as an intern when we were doing this series, so she may call on her to correct my mistakes here. So I guess first I'll outline sort of what we did and why we did it. We started 2013 that year, kind of trying to find a project or find something that we could do as a bureau. We have 6 people in the Globe's Washington bureau, and so we want it's sort of enough to where we could sort of break off or have 1 or 2 people break off for longer term stories. And so that's what we ended up doing, and we decided to choose a topic that was seemingly obvious about partisanship and gridlock, but do it in a way that was sort of got beyond sort of the day-to-day, minute-to-minute Twitter wars and kind of got underlying sort of what was happening in Washington and how it was impacting the country. So we did it in several ways where we wrote about redistricting or money in politics. We explored sort of the Tea Party's rise and their increasing influence, why the FEC was deadlocked. So we looked at it from a whole host of different angles, all of them trying to sort of, like you were saying, like get at a story and find a way to make it accessible to an average reader. And our readership is not in the Beltway. They're not sort of looking at Washington every day. So we were trying to do that. So I wanted to start and maybe just go through. It got kind of ridiculously long. I think we had 19 parts in the series. Some of them, most of them, like sort of deep dives that would, take a couple weeks to do, and would result in like a full page or 2 pages inside a Sunday story. There were a couple of them. I did one on the Farm Bill failing, and that was sort of a marker for, businesses as usual here. That people are not cooperating, and it sort of reflected the gridlock. That was like a one-off, sort of a daily story that we sort of turned into kind of a broken city. But we started off with, and I can kind of talk most educated about my own stories, but we started off with courts and how Obama's nominees were not getting approved. And this was most prominent in the D.C. circuit, which later led to like a much bigger fight and sort of a change in filibuster rules and sort of all these other things in the Senate. But at the time, it was more just exploring where the areas in the courts were being affected. And the D.C. court was a crucial area because they're making all these decisions on regulations and rules that, Dodd-Frank and healthcare. They're deciding things because they're in D.C. that Congress has passed and the rulemaking. And so it's a very influential court, and the Obama's nominees were not being approved. And so John Roberts, he sat on this court before he went to the Supreme Court, and his seat was still vacant, like 3 or 4 years later. So there's like a tremendous vacancy in this court out of politics. So that was our sort of how we kicked the series off. And we also did one of the best stories out of the series was one that my colleague Michael Kranish did on Bob Dole. It was about a disability treaty that Bob Dole had been pushing for, and he was wheeled onto the Senate floor, and his own party rejected him. They voted down the disability treaty, and sort of a key component was, I think it was Pat Roberts. I mean, it was his own colleague from Kansas who sort of like told Dole he was on board, he would vote for it, and then in the end he didn't, and there was like a crucial vote that it couldn't override the filibuster. So we sat down, Michael Kranish sat down with Bob Dole, and Dole was sort of reflecting on the state of politics, the state of his own party, and it was sort of a memorable story told through the eyes of Dole as he looks on Congress now and he looks at the Senate now and sort of what it's turned into. I went to Kansas to do a story in Tim Huelscamp's district. He's sort of a hardcore Tea Party guy, and went and spent a couple days as he went to town halls and talking to constituents and sort of tried to reflect like just basically the mood of that district, which was Huelskamp was sort of a leader in the Hell No caucus. The guys that didn't want to raise the debt ceiling, they wanted government shutdowns. They were sort of angry at the current state of Washington. And the story sort of illustrated like Huelskamp is doing what his constituents want. There is a group out there and a portion of the country that wants him to go and sort of throw sand in the wheels of government. And so that story was, it was interesting, sort of the reaction I got from Massachusetts, which is an area that does not subscribe to that type of politics. And so people were very upset that like these people could believe these things. And I think it was good. It was like a reflection of what's going on in the country and why Washington was gridlocked. Because there was a sort of a faction of Congress that was with Tim Huelskamp, and he reflected that area of Congress.
Can I stop you a minute?
Yeah.
I have a question about this. The reaction of people in Massachusetts to this story. It sounds like what you're saying is they were really surprised. They didn't, people in Massachusetts really didn't get that people in Kansas felt that way.
Yeah.
For real, a lot of them. And they never read What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yeah.
So
a lot of the feedback I got from our readers was, they were upset that this exists. They don't understand why. We have a all Democratic delegation. I guess at the time, I don't think we had Scott Brown still in the Senate. So like everybody was a Democrat. And so it was like they sort of had an interesting reaction, I think, to the fact that there is a constituency out there that.
Right. See, to me, that makes the story instantly valuable, right? Because they brought to Massachusetts a perspective that's really surprised a lot of people about what it's like in other parts of the country, what people who don't think like you actually think. And that's just incredibly valuable. And I don't know how often many of us are able to do that.
We had a great, the layout too, for this particular story, was like we had this like panoramic image that we stripped like right across the top of the fold. So it was like really, something that we don't do a lot of. And so, I think that was compelling too, was the imagery of it, of this rural Kansas and how these people feel about Washington and what's happening. And for good or for, you can agree or disagree with how these people in Kansas feel, but they feel that. And that's why they're sending Huelskamp to Washington. So I think it was an informative perspective to highlight. Another thing that we did was I spent time with this guy, Rick Nolan, who's from Minnesota, and he had 32 years between his terms. It's the longest gap in congressional history. His staff calls him Rick Van Winkle. So, he says, like, he sort of felt like he went to sleep and woke up and he doesn't recognize where he is anymore. Everything's different. The amount of time that he has to fundraise is different. The amount of time that they spend in committee meetings is different. Sort of the complete atmosphere of the Congress that he's serving in now is totally different from the way that it was 32 years ago. So that was sort of another kind of narrative way of telling a pretty simple concept, that Congress is different, and here's the ways in which they are different, told through the eyes of this guy who was there and now he's back. So I, for that story, spent quite a bit of time with him and sort of spent, sort of told it through his eyes. And let's see, one of the other things that we did one on think tanks and how think tanks have gotten more partisan. And the New York Times had a good story on this on Sunday. We were a year earlier on a think tank story, but it was kind of a broader take on sort of think tanks and where their funding is coming from and how think tanks are not so nonpartisan at times. Another great story was on the FEC. We looked at, there's 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and they're constantly deadlocked. They don't make any decisions, and almost by design, they have 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and historically they've kind of managed to get along, but in recent years it's like they're making no decisions, which in essence is changing our campaign finance laws because they're not enforcing different things because they can't come into an agreement on whether or not to enforce something. So, and then sort of one other story that I'll highlight is one that I did on Obama, because we were conscious of the fact that our stories were about the Tea Party, Republic. Bob Dole hates his own party now. There was a lot of like sort of Republicans are at fault in creating the gridlock, and so what I wanted to do was look at Obama and look back at his own vision and how he came to the national stage, even in Boston in 2004, talking about not having a red states and blue states, but one United States. And Newsweek put him on the cover as the purple president or the purple politician or something at that time. So we looked at a host of different records and sort of ways to figure out him living up to that promise. And like, to be sure, like not all of it's his fault, but there's the picture of Obama. It's like, it sort of says it all. So I looked at who's on his staff and where they come from. National Journal actually did some data crunching on that we used, where it showed that the vast majority of his staff was coming. They grew up in blue states. We looked at where he traveled as president and how many days he spent there. And the statistics were pretty telling, where he spent far more time in blue states than he did in red states. He hadn't been to Kentucky, for example, I think, and several other red states. And we looked at his golfing, who he's golfing with, and he's never golfing with politicians. And then the most telling thing for me was it took him about 2 years to have a one-on-one meeting with John Boehner. And I couldn't document one time that he'd been alone in the room with Mitch McConnell. So just like the dialogue or the exchange or just meeting with these guys, I think once you stack it all up, he does shoulder some of the blame for the current atmosphere and the current tenor in our politics. And so I think that was a story that we tried to do just to sort of put him, to look at him and what he's done. And there's him and McConnell. I guess he met with him twice, but there were aides in the room. So anyway. So David Axelrod sort of conceded, like it's a lock that we could not pick, in terms of him living up to becoming sort of healing the divide, the partisan divide. So for our final part, we did we tried to find solutions. It's like the Boston Globe's way to fix Washington, So we we decided, and we took up 4 pages inside. It was sort of the end of the series, and what we did is we went to different places, really around the world. Michael Granish went to London to look at like a parliamentary system and how they work. Not suggesting that we do a parliamentary system necessarily, but sort of the lessons that a different system shows us.
And did you guys like draw straws for that assignment? Or?
I think Michael's the deputy bureau chief, so I think he decided he was going to go to London. I actually had proposed, he overruled me because I wanted to go and do something on the Ask David Cameron question time. Yeah, I wanted to like sort of do a tongue in cheek, like it would heal a lot of our wounds if we had question time. You know, if Obama had to go up every week to Congress and address these guys, and they have to address him, and you know, you could sort of just get it all off your chest, you know, in that question time period. But I was overruled, and you did a much more serious story. And then, you know, Noah Bierman went to Connecticut and did something on their campaign finance system, which is working a lot differently. Tracy Jan went to Iowa and wrote about their redistricting, which is a lot different from any other state, where they have to do. I mean, Iowa is kind of a state that makes this easy, but you have to do it sort of by county, and there's all these squares in Iowa, so you just sort of divide it up, and it prohibits, not prohibits, but it makes it more difficult to do any sort of gerrymandered system. So we looked at that because that was like Tracy also did a story out of North Carolina on their gerrymandered districts and how everything was sort of, you know, getting all out of whack because of the way that they were drawing their lines. And then I went to California and did a story on they've changed their election, their primaries to have a top 2 system is what they call it, where the top 2 vote getters, regardless of party, move on to the general election. So I wrote about a district outside of San Francisco where there were 2 Democrats who advanced, and the Democrat who did a better job at appealing to the Republicans in the district won. Eric Swalwell beat Pete Stark, and Pete Stark had been there for ages. You know, Swalwell was, I don't know if he was born when Pete Stark first started serving in Congress. So he was the most entrenched Democrat you can imagine, and Swalwell was sort of this young guy, and he had Republicans on his campaign team and was knocking doors on the houses of Republicans and sort of trying to get Republicans engaged in a general election when almost, you know, for decades they haven't mattered because the district is so liberal that whoever wins the primary always wins the general election. But because Swalwell was able to, you know, garner Republican support, he won. So it was sort of, there's still like controversy over this system, the top 2, and whether it's going to solve all of our, you know, electoral problems. But it was one experiment that's being done that we tried to write about. And I think with that final series, like final part of the series, we sort of ran the risk of it seeming like a political science journal. You know, I mean, it was like all these like wonky ideas that states are trying out. But what we tried again to do was find some narrative way into it where it's like, you know, the young upstart beating Pete Stark, or you know, or Tracy focused on the guys who like draw the lines in Iowa and like all their data and how they're doing it. So we tried to find narrative ways in to do those last stories, and we found, you know, the reaction from readers was like, it was really rewarding. We had at the end of it, we had the Globe has started this thing called Globe Insiders, where it's for loyal subscribers to come and sort of, you know, for events, you know, at night. And so our whole DC bureau flew up to Boston and had one of these Globe Insider events. And it was like, for the longest time, you're writing these stories and you get emails, but like, you know, we were at one night in Boston, and you have a room packed full of people who are interested in asking intelligent questions. And you know, at one point, one of us was like referring to one of the articles, and the question was like, "Yeah, I know, I read the story." You know, it's like, okay, you know, like they were like loyal readers to this series. You know, so I think it did end up striking a chord, and people did find it interesting, and they were willing to read long stories. I mean, none of these were that short. They weren't, you know, 800-word stories. They were taking up significant space and significant resources and significant time on our part, where we could like break away for several weeks' time to pursue something like this. So in the end, it was a totally rewarding experience to get out of sort of the day-to-day Washington sort of muck, you know. So
if it was rewarding for the reporters and it was rewarding for the readers, what did your editors think?
They were high on it. I mean, and actually, I should say that the whole concept came from we had an editor change. Marty Barron was our editor. Now he's at the Washington Post, and Brian McGrory became editor. This was one of his babies. You know, one of his first things was like, let's do something big, and let's do it on sort of this paralysis that we keep reading about and we keep talking about. Let's do something in depth on it. So he was really high on it from the beginning. And if anything, it was like, you know, our first story came out in March. It was like, where's that first story? Like, when are you guys going to do it? You know, so he was like kind of pushing us to go faster. So editors were definitely totally on board from the beginning. And it was like getting feedback from the newsroom too was like refreshing, you know, because I mean, we're sort of a satellite. So when we all went back, you know, it was sort of rewarding to like run into people and they were like reading the series, you know, they were reading it, you know, and it was a good thing. Yeah.
So you mentioned it reverberating with, you know, your Massachusetts readers. There's a handful of local papers around the country that have really good Washington coverage. The Globe being one of them. When you're writing, but you're competing for stories with the Washington Press Corps. Many of us write for sort of more nationally focused.
Yeah.
So like when you're writing, are you thinking about your readers as back in Massachusetts? Are you thinking about competing on the national level? How do you balance?
It's interesting. I mean, and I started working on this right after covering Mitt Romney's presidential campaign, which is a totally different environment, kind of. I mean, I felt pressure competing on a national level, covering Mitt Romney for the Globe against, you know, the Times or the Post, or, you know, you were like definitely competing on a national level on that story. I feel like day to day, we're able to sort of have an interesting place in the DC metabolism. We will cover things. When Obama gives his speech on Wednesday, I'm sure that we'll cover that live. But there's not many things that sort of we'll cover that don't have like a specific angle for us, or where we have a specific thing where we can be a little bit different on, where we try not to be sort of matching the pack, you know, as much. Because we can't. I mean, we have 6 people, and so we're competing against huge organizations that have many more resources. So this was a way, I think, for us, it was ideal to kind of break off and do something, you know. I mean, we still covered like the government shutdown and the debt ceiling fights and things like that as daily news stories, but we tried to have like something that would dig a little bit deeper, you know, and provide a little bit more context. But it's I mean, it's hard, I think, because.
But when you were writing it, I mean, who were you thinking about as your sort of core readers, or were you?
I don't know that I thought like I want the woman in Natick, Massachusetts to wake up and like feel like different about this story than like the person in Springfield, Illinois. You know, I mean, but our readership is going to be the woman in Natick. But I don't know that was in the back of my head. Like, I've got to tell a good story for that person, because it was almost like when I was in Kansas, it was like I could feel like how that would reverberate with people in Massachusetts, just because they come from a different political ideology, but generally. But I don't know that I had that in the back of my mind, that I'm writing for that person specifically. If that kind of, yeah.
What was the word count in each of the stories, like an estimate? And I asked that question because I know that as good as a story might be, you know, you might lose a reader when you go beyond the 2,000 words. And I know that's a conversation that editors have, you know, with their reporters, because you can't write a novel, obviously.
Totally. And you know, I would find myself, I mean, you have to rein yourself in, and like probably other people in the bureau in, you know, like we're sort of like eager and we're like writing a lot. And I mean, the word counts would get quite high. I mean, they were like, they would probably be an average, I mean, like 2,000 to 4,000 words, you know, would probably be the sort of range. I mean, like the one on the Farm Bill was probably like 1,000 words or 1,200 words or something. But like the stories that would take several weeks, like the Obama story was probably, I don't know, 3,000 words, I guess, but you know. And
this is more digital because I'm also on the digital side. But did you get into metrics as far as like, did people stay on the website for a really long time reading the stories?
Yeah.
Did they save them in, you know, Pocket and read them later?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure that we have that. I don't know. At some point, we did produce an ebook that was like I mean, I have no clue what the readership on that was. Like, who was like, man, I got to get the Broken City ebook. My mom bought it, I know. But, I mean, so I feel like there was enough, like, enough of an appetite at the paper, at least, to create that, So, I mean, I feel like the metrics had to be decent to decide to make an ebook out of it. But I don't have the numbers in terms of, like, whether readership, like, skyrocketed or plummeted or whatever on those days. I mean, I do know. I mean, and it's hard to gauge exactly from this event in Boston. I mean, it was like the loyal of loyal readers would like show up on a Wednesday night or whenever it was, to talk about paralysis in Washington. But I mean, but gauging from that, I mean, there was definitely like high interest in what we were doing. Yeah.
I'm curious to hear about y'all's brainstorming. Like, when you decided to look at DC from this lens, was it just obvious that you were going to go to Kansas and London, or did you really have to think through what you were going to write?
Yeah, we really had to think through it. I mean, it wasn't like... I think part of the concern in starting this out was like, how do we do this in a way that doesn't feel like so obvious? Like, yeah, Washington is broken. Like, nothing is working. It's we know this. So I think, like, at least I kept in the back of my head, like, it's bad. Like, you think it's bad, but it's even worse than you think. And so how do you convey that? Like, how do you tell people, like, you think it's this bad, but it's really this bad? So I mean, I think that there was an effort to find stories that you could really like smack people in the face with how bad it's gotten. But it wasn't obvious. I mean, like this first story that we did on the court system, initially I was looking through all the district courts, and I was dead set on going to Nevada because I felt like the district court there was like all in, they weren't getting their judges approved, and it was resulting in a backlog in cases. And ultimately we decided like the better story is out of the DC circuit because it's like much more influential. It's a much more powerful court. And, the fact that John Roberts' seat is still vacant, I mean, it's been since filled, but like that was like compelling enough to where we sort of switched gears. But that only came after a week or two of research of like going through numbers and figuring out like where's the friction point in the court system and all of these judges not being confirmed. So it wasn't so obvious. I mean, and then there was one story that we did on the media that was, I know, like we struggled with like how do we tell that in some new way, and I don't know that we totally found a new way to tell that one, but like that was a hard one to like figure out. Like we know Fox is partisan and and then looking at CNN or MSNBC and like we sort of know these things, so it was like hard to go to the next level on some of that.
Right.
Whereas Bob Dole, I feel like, was telling us something new through the eyes of Bob Dole.
Right.
Yeah.
When you write long stories like this, do you feel pressure to make sure they perform well so that you'll be getting resources and time to do stuff like this in the future?
In the future? Yeah, I mean, I again, like I feel like I don't know that this exists in a lot of places anymore. I mean, I feel like you were talking about, like a lot of news organizations are cutting back on Washington coverage, and as they do, it's sort of like you're left with covering your delegation, I mean, and that's important as a vital role for news organizations to do. But there's not, if you only have one person or two people, then that's all you can do, and it leaves you much less time, I think, and resources to break off and do something more in depth. I feel like we're still fortunate that there hasn't been cutbacks at the Globe and the Washington Bureau. I came down in 2010, and we've not had any cutbacks since then. And I don't think going back a couple years before I came down. So they've sort of kept us whole, which has been a positive thing. And in the future, right now we're doing. It was hard because this series was so fun and well received. We're on our next. So we decided like this year we're going to do another sort of more in-depth thing. It was harder to settle on what to do. So what we're doing is a series called Power Lines that is designed to sort of illustrate the the back and forth between New England and Washington and sort of the different aspects of power that exist through that. So right now I'm sort of crunching numbers and sort of going through trying to find all of our former delegation members and their staffers who have gone on to become lobbyists. So like Ted Kennedy left like an army of lobbyists, or an army of staffers who have since become lobbyists. So that's kind of like what we're trying to do now, is like illustrate the power line that exists between Boston and Washington. Which gets to your point, like that's a very localized version of something that nobody else is really going to do. But I could say like we still have the time to pursue that. So I guess I'm nervous about the media in general having time to pursue it, like more in-depth stories. I mean, we can see from like the New York Times and the Washington Post still do great work on this type of stuff. I feel like for papers of our size or smaller, it's getting increasingly difficult to do things that are relevant for different audiences around the country in a way like that. Yeah.
This is more of a process question, and you got to it a little bit, but I know one of the big things in media about like special projects is that whenever you have a bunch of reporters working on like one big thing, it takes them away from other daily things that need to get done. So I guess if we could just talk a little bit about how you all managed to do that, like when you went to or when you traveled to authority, something like backfill for you.
Yeah.
And are you guys like, is that a model that you all are going to? Because I'd be pretty good about Boston.
I think like we probably set out, and our editors were really good about this, like probably 80% of the time, where like if you're off on we're doing a Broken City story, like you're untouchable. Like we're not going to like pull you off to like come and ask you to do some daily story about the debt ceiling. But then like we're all reporters and we like to gripe about editors, so there would always be that time like, okay, like we really we got so and so's on vacation and so's sick. The president's giving a speech tomorrow. We need you to cover it. And so then like it'll still like pull you off of like what you're really focused and invested in. But I would say like 80% of the time, like everybody was kind of fully on board and like great about kind of clearing the decks for you. And 6 people is like, I would love to have 8 or 10 people in our bureau, but like 6 is still pretty healthy, where you can kind of, it's just enough to kind of like make that rotation work. And we have enough like utility players in the bureau where you can like somebody else can sub in and cover, so we have loose beats, but like people can kind of float around, and like if I'm covering the White House, but if I need to go up to Congress, I can, that kind of thing. And so if there's there'll be some of that like floating around to fill in or backfill for somebody else. And editors were pretty good about like kind of respecting the process.
Are they willing, to fill in with wire stories on sort of national, the congressional?
Yeah. I mean, we've always had a debate about that. I mean, like, you like hate to see a wire story on the front page about a Washington thing as like a Washington bureau reporter, but they would do. There have been times, when they've done that, and like where there's messages from editors in Boston, like, don't take this as like a slap in your face. Like we're not going to be able to match everything that is happening, and you need to be cleared up to do something more in depth. But I think still, like, you see that, you want your story on the front page, even if it's like one that you'll forget a week from then, like, yeah.
So what is the one thing you can tell us that was the most valuable thing you learned since you got to Washington reporting? Something you made a mistake and you learned, a tip you picked up, crucial piece of advice.
I feel like I don't know if this will get like a fully answer it, but I feel like there's so much low-hanging fruit in Washington. Like there's a story that you could do every single day, and you could do it easily and quickly, and you might forget it. It'll be forgettable. And I feel like it's finding those stories that you'll remember like a year from now or 2 years from now or at the end of your career. Like you look back on it and was like, man, that was a fun story to do, and like it was great. And I feel like in Washington, it's super hard to find those stories, in part because there's so many reporters and everybody's kind of pursuing different things, and so it's hard to stick out from the pack. Like there's so many other people. So I feel like it's fine. I mean, ideally, I'd answer your question by telling you how to find those stories, but I mean, I think it is like I will remember that Kansas story and like feel like was a story that was like fun to tell. I could capture something in a way that was unique, and I'll remember it. And I feel like there are a lot of stories. I mean, I feel like during the debt ceiling, I think I was on the front page for like 13 days in a row, but like I couldn't tell you what any of those stories said. Now, because it's like they're forgettable. And they're just like news of the day kind of thing. So I think it's trying to break out of that news of the day kind of mentality, which is important, I think. And we're like in a breaking news environment, so you want to break news. But I mean, I think it's trying to find those stories that you'll be proud of a year from now or 2 years from now.
And include on your next clip reel. Right?
Yeah, exactly. yeah.
You have mentioned several times being on the front page, which I take to mean the hard copy.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, I remember some of these stories like really reverberating and like, leading playbook or whatever because of the digital reach that you can have. So, I mean, do you think of yourself as working for a newspaper, or how do you sort of balance that?
I'm still like I'm 34, and like I feel like I still get like the Post and the Times, like the hard copies at my door, and the Wall Street Journal hard copy at the office. Like I'm still like a hard newspaper kind of guy, which probably like most of my friends, like the vast majority of my friends are not. Like they're totally digital. So I mean, I feel like I've like grown up in that environment of like still thinking of the front page being a significant like marker of if I've done my job well. But like in reality, especially in the Washington bureau for the Globe, like the front page doesn't matter. And I've kind of learned that over time, like with Playbook or with other things, that you can have a story reverberate that was like a blog post or like something that was inside the paper, but it was like unique enough that like it got traction, in a different way. So I mean, I still think of the front page as a marker, but I also sort of see the increasing value in that, or in Twitter, like in Twitter, and like having a voice on Twitter, or having like sort of some ability to create, buzz in that way, And I feel like all of that stuff is like becoming increasingly important, in a way that like ideally you can like use 140 characters to draw somebody to a 3,000 word story,
But you still think newspaper first most of the time?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I mean, like I think that's evolving more and more. Like at the Globe and like with me, like I feel like I sort of think more digitally, now. But I probably am still like geared toward like newspaper first. And like I think the Globe has gotten more like we used to like not post our stories until like the next morning, like with the paper, and like increasingly they're like posted when they're ready, so they'll post that night after they've been edited. So I mean, I think there's like more metabolism to, for newspaper stories to get it out whenever you are done with it, instead of holding it for the front doorstep person. Yeah.
So you guys have 6 people in DC?
Yeah.
Are there, outside of like the sort of traditional national newspapers, are there any other? It sounds like a lot, actually. I mean, which is nice. But
Yeah.
I mean, are there other newspapers or chains or whatever that have that many?
I don't think so. I mean, I think we are the largest like regional
Yeah.
bureau. The Tribune bureau has I think like 30 people or something like that writing for the Tribune chain, so with the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune. So they have more, but they have like a bigger sort of audience. So I don't think that there's, aside from that, like I can only think of like places that have like 1 or 2 or 3 people. It's like a much smaller sort of thing, which we've been fortunate. I mean, Boston.
What about McClatchy?
McClatchy, yeah. I guess McClatchy has they have a sizable bureau too. Yeah.
So when you're writing one of these longer stories like this, when you have some time from your editors and some space, and you're looking at a a more like conceptual idea of it, just like a play-by-play of an event. How do you know when the story's done? Like, when do you stop recording and put down the pen and start writing?
I think that's a good question. I mean, like, so like with the judge's story, like, it was like, I probably could have kept reporting that story, and there's like so many different stories to tell and so many different ways into it that eventually, I don't know, it's just like Brian McGrory is like, where's my story? And you sort of say, well, I gotta, we gotta, this is like the closest one to the finish line, and so just like write that one up, even though maybe, and who knows, maybe it would have benefited or maybe it would not have by spending another 2 weeks kind of conceptualizing and trying to find like the best stream to go down to tell the story. But I think I don't know, like it's like you would sort of spend spend a couple weeks on something, and oftentimes, I mean, and those first couple weeks are like incredibly frustrating because you can't, at least for me, like I couldn't see the story. It's like you're just swimming in numbers or swimming in information. On that judge's story too, I was also initially intrigued with this idea of the blue slip, which exists in Congress, where senators actually get a physical blue slip if they have a home state, if a judge is nominated from their home state. And so oftentimes what they'll do, if they don't like that judge, they just won't turn in their blue slip. And that automatically like halts the whole process, which seemed like incredibly anachronistic and sort of ridiculous to me. So I was trying to like go down this like this road of like blue slips, like like this like quirky blue slip process, and spent like days researching the history on blue slips, and like different chairs of the Judiciary Committee had different practices on how they honored the blue slip process, and in the past it generally worked, but it just like in the end like it was like a couple days. Eventually I wrote about blue slips, like much not part of the series, but like like I spent a couple days just like spinning my wheels on, just because I was kind of interested in blue slips, and then spent another week like just mining data for like Nevada or like I was thinking like immigration courts, in Arizona might be interesting, so I was like looking at their judicial vacancies, and eventually the story just sort of like it became clear, and part of that's like brainstorming with editors and sort of talking through it. But I don't know. I mean, I found like those first couple, like that first week or two, incredibly. It's both fun, but also really frustrating because you don't know where you're going. And I feel like you have to let yourself go through that. And ideally, you have an organization that lets you kind of like spend a couple days figuring out the arcane history of blue slips. But eventually, like something would emerge, at least for me. After a while. Yeah.
So, I have a question. I don't know where you live politically, but spending in Kansas, I just spent kind of a similar weekend on where there's people who believe something that will be different generally from my readership. And it would be so easy to portray them all as like local yokels, So how do you bring that perspective to a new audience and get this political reading without, taking cheap shots? Like, where do you go there?
I mean, and I ran the risk of doing some of that in the Kansas story, and I did get feedback from some people in Kansas who said like we're not all like right wing Republicans, and and I got it was, and I think one of the Kansas papers did an editorial off of like our story, and it got like odd traction in Kansas. Oh, and I got this photo that we ran. I got like people felt like that was not a fair representation of a guy in camouflage, like shaking Tim Hielskam's hand. But there was a part in the story where I was like, I sort of focused on this place called Jetmore, which was 867 people lived there, and there was a part at which, and then like this guy Charles Lee was like smoking a electric cigarette, It was like just great, like colorful detail, like in Kansas. But one of the things that came up twice was like jokes about assassination, about the president. And I included those, and I included both of them in the piece. And I felt like, and I got emails on that, like, is that fair? Not all people want to assassinate the president in Kansas. But I felt like I forget where it is. I don't know. Like I felt, it's just stupid. Where's Lee Harvey Oswald? Where's Lee Harvey when you need him? And then he's like saying, "Oh, that's not very nice." And then the next morning, I don't know. Anyway, it's in here somewhere. The next morning, somebody said the same thing. Basically. so I quoted them. I mean, and I felt like that reflected, like, not that these guys like had a gun in their. Well, I mean, maybe they did, but like they were not like seriously contemplating assassination. But it was something that was like okay to joke about, or at least like sort of say. And so I felt like that was an important reflection of them. And I felt like because it happened twice, and I should show readers that it happened twice, like that this was like something that existed in this little town in Kansas, and I think that's the risk too. I mean, you're putting a microscope on this like one town as emblematic of something larger. And I think that's where the, potential criticism could lie. But I felt like, judging from, the 2 days that I spent in this little town, I felt like it reflected something that existed there. And everybody was like completely, I mean, the odd thing about that place was, and I don't remember if this made it in this story, this was like one of those things that an editor probably cut, but like that people there would, at the diner would pour, like if the waitress was busy, would get up and they would get the pot of coffee and pour coffee for the other customers, And it was like a very collegial place and a very like homey environment. Everybody's like perfectly pleasant to me. They just hate government, and the president, and so like they'll pour your coffee while they joke about Obama being, where's Lee Harvey Oswald, So it's like a juxtaposition, I think, that explains something about Jetmore, Kansas. Probably not all of Kansas for sure, but I mean I think it was an important reflection on what was going on there, and why these people wanted Huell's camp to come and like say no to everything. Yeah.
The Globe is such a legacy paper, but y'all also have an award-winning website. Like in this series or in future series, would y'all consider non-traditional storytelling formats?
Like
I don't know, like charts or.
We had something. And this is kind of non-traditional, but a Metro reporter named Billy Baker had done something on Twitter where he had done a story about I may get some of the details wrong, but about a kid from the inner city who struggled, and he wrote about him at one point and then established a relationship with him after the story ran and was like driving the kid to like colleges and stuff like that. And the kid got into Harvard or Yale or some Ivy League school, and it was like a big deal, and the kid called him, and Billy's like kind of tweeting like a whole series of things that like totally went viral. And I don't know how we did it in the paper, if we just ran I think we just ran his tweets, but it was like a non-traditional way of telling a story. I mean, Billy was kind of at the center of the story, but it was, a story kind of in that way. I don't know other non-traditional ways. I mean, we've tried video. I mean, we still do some video, and some of that works and some of it doesn't, I think. And some charts, I think, work and some don't. I mean, I think this piece that I'm trying to do on the Kennedy Network and other sort of Massachusetts-based, lobbyists who have ties to Massachusetts politicians, like that will be like probably a chart-intensive, story where almost like the chart may be more interesting than the story. I mean, hopefully the story will be interesting. Yeah, lots of big players and
Can I ask a question that this sort of goes back to the traditional storytelling? You were working on this as a team, but were all the stories written individually, or did you ever partner with other reporters on the actual writing? And if so, any tips for people reporters who are trying to write stories jointly?
We never, I don't think any of the stories had a double byline. I think we all did our own stories. That said, I mean, there was like a lot of back and forth. It's a pretty collegial group, so like I would have a colleague read my draft, or I'd read his draft, and we'd sort of critique each other's work and help refine it in that way. Michael Cranish, our deputy bureau chief, who got to go to London, is a pretty like narrative storytelling kind of journalist, and has had a lot of experience in Washington. So he would often have a lot of hands in sort of the editing of it, and he wrote a lot of this, several of the stories too. But they were all done individually, the stories.
I
Yeah.
have a question also. I'm wondering if the series overlapped the marathon bombing, and if so, did that large of an event impact your resources or timing even of when the pieces came out?
It did, actually. Yeah. It did happen. So our first piece came out in March, and then the bombing was a month later. So it impacted us a little bit in terms of just resources, like in terms of our Washington bureau sort of mobilizing to cover. From Washington, we were covering sort of intelligence failures and like not catching the Tsarnaevs as they were exiting and leaving the country. So or congressional hearings on it. So we were working on stories from here that related to the bombings, and so there were times, I guess, where we would have to. I don't know if it ever overlapped. Like it would be, two of us would be working on bombing marathon sort of stuff, and one of us would be off on the project. I think it probably have impact. None of our stories probably ran in that like 2-week period, where it was just like every day there was some new development in that story. So it impacted, like, I guess, getting a story in the paper probably more than it did like our resources in Washington. It was a big year. That was like between that and sort of doing a big series like this, it was a big year. Yeah.
How do you try to, because you're writing for a readership that might not be inside the Beltway, how do you try to, like, sometimes, I don't know, I guess, like, explain Washington? Like, how do you avoid the trap that we all fall into? Like you said, like, it's more broken than you think, but, like, how do you keep yourself sort of outside the Beltway perspective?
Yeah, it's like you can't use a continuing resolution in a story very easily. You have to like explain. I think it is like trying to. Somebody told me, so when I first came here, I was covering Congress, and somebody told me to treat it like it's a foreign assignment. Like you're in some foreign country, and like not everything that happens is going to be important, and it may be important in that building, but like your readers are not necessarily going to care about every single thing that's happening. So you don't cover it the same way as you would for The Hill or for Roll Call or something where like that's their like total universe, and that's like they were trying to own Congress, and so I would kind of treat it like not like it is totally a foreign country, but like you're having to explain things and having to pick stories that will resonate in a little bit of a different way, that it's not just the incremental sort of things. And I remember it's like some days, like when I first got to Congress, like calling editors like, oh my gosh, like this didn't pass cloture. Like we've got to like, do something on the web on this, and it's like, okay, like it doesn't matter. Like it's a big deal around there, and it's like, but like everybody around you in the Senate press gallery is like buzzing over cloture not passing, so you feel like it's a big deal. And it is for some, for news organizations that depend on like minute moving news, like that it is, and it's a big development for the day. But for us, it would be sort of like, don't worry about that, So I think that's hard. I think it is hard, and particularly coming from Washington, because you're surrounded by people who are interested in that sort of minute moving, information, and I think it's hard to sort of break out of that sometimes. Yeah.
Just a follow-up question. Do you always tie back your stories to local politics, have some clause on, and this is how it will affect you, or you just write it and take what you want out of it?
I think it varies. Like we were talking about earlier about sort of news of the day, and like sometimes I feel like our stories will be no different from what you would read in the Times or the Post or any other news outlet. They would just have like our delegation member as the lead quote, and it would be, sort of, here's what your member of Congress thinks about Syria, and so, I mean, I think in that respect, like, we sort of think about, like, not trying to miss anything on our delegation or sort of what the elected members from Massachusetts are thinking or doing. And I think, there is, that we sort of an internal joke sometimes about how parochial we can be, not only at the Globe, but just Boston in general. I mean, it's very parochial. Like, they call themselves the hub of the universe is like the nickname for Boston. So when Hillary Clinton's book came out, I did a story that we put on the front page that was on members from Massachusetts, like people from Massachusetts who were not mentioned in her book. So she didn't mention, Deval Patrick. She didn't mention Ed Markey or Elizabeth Warren. She mentioned John Kerry X amount of times. It was like ridiculously kind of over the top, but it sort of fit with our sort of, parochial attitude about things. Like, how dare the, former First Lady and Secretary of State, like, not include our politicians in her new book, So, I mean, I think there is, like, some tongue-in-cheek to that, but I think there's also, like, we're trying to relate to people back in Massachusetts as, like, that's where, like, our core audience is, in New England. Yeah.
Do you struggle at all, like, when you want to sidestep the news of the day because your readers don't need it, source management, where your lawmakers are like those other folks in the press gallery, like, this is so important, why aren't you writing about it?
Yeah. Elizabeth Warren is giving a big speech on the Senate floor.
Yeah.
Like, we gotta, I mean, and I think that sometimes is a challenge. I mean, and I feel like the web is sometimes a good outlet for some of that. Like, you could still cover it, and it still takes time. I mean, it's not like you just, I think editors sometimes feel like it takes like 10 seconds to type up something to put it online. Like, oh yeah, just whip it up and put it online. But I mean, it still takes time to do, but I feel like it's less of a time suck than like other things that you can still sort of capture sort of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And like kind of manage sources or like sort of like feel like they're getting something out of the relationship. Yeah.
You mentioned Liz Warren. I've been told that she's like notoriously press averse. That she, you can't stop her in the hallway. Just doesn't really talk to anybody. Maybe rivaled only by like Al Franken in that regard. So how do you, as a reporter, go about navigating that when you do have a politician who's just kind of like really basically never tell you anything?
So in that case, we wrote about her not talking to us, which came, so for a while she was pretty accessible to us, and she's probably like more accessible to us than any other news outlet. Mm-hmm. But there was a couple of incidents where like she kind of gave us a brush off when we're trying to ask her about something and said she'd get back to us. She didn't get back to us, and so we put in the story. She refused to comment, and then editors started saying, well, like, what is the deal? Like, why is she not talking to us? So we ended up doing a story, me and Noah Bierman, on and we struggled with like the right tone for it, because to like not make us totally like the subject, like she's not talking to us, so we're going to write about you. Okay. So we did it in a way that's like she's bucking the tradition of this quirky tradition actually in the Senate, where like any senator generally is approachable. Like, you can walk up to John McCain and ask him a question about like whatever you want, what his summer vacation plans are, or like what he thinks about Syria. You can ask him anything. And there are very few that have like avoided that, and she's one of them. I mean, Barack Obama, when he was senator, did not do that. So we like kind of made her out to look like she's not a part of this hallowed tradition in the hallways of the Senate of like talking to members of the press. And we talked to other senators about like their own policies. Like Barbara Mikulski will talk to the media anywhere except for on an escalator. Like she's like nervous about falling if she's like trying to talk while she's on the escalator, which we found out by talking to her on an escalator, like going up. So like we kind of tried to do it tongue in cheek, but also kind of poke at her for not being willing to stop and talk to members of the media. So I mean, but it is hard. I mean, there's, I guess there was another incident when I was based in Boston and covering John Kerry. He was running for re-election in, I think, 2006, and he had a Democratic primary opponent 2 years after he lost the presidency. So it was like really demeaning that he had to like fake run for re-election against a Democrat, after he just lost the presidency. So he was not eager to talk, and I went out to like Western Massachusetts and was talking to his opponent, and then I tried to interview Kerry, and his staff was like, yeah, I'll talk to you. And Kerry like totally brushed me off. And so I put in the story, John Kerry said in a 57-second interview with the Globe, to like poke him for like, and before he slammed the door and sped off, because he was like being kind of a jerk about, not being willing to answer any questions. But it also reflected kind of like, he does not want to be in the situation of like running for re-election. So I mean, I don't know if there's like any like, there's probably nice ways to do it, but I feel like also like poking them publicly, like kind of maybe helps. I don't know. Elizabeth Warren is still kind of like shy in the hallways, so I don't think she's changed her MO after our story. But
how does our staff react to that story?
I don't feel like they reacted that much, which is like kind of fits like kind of I don't know. They're not like that. Like they don't react when you want them to give you something, and they didn't react. I don't think we got like huge pushback.
Well,
maybe before that we did. Maybe before, because we asked her. We asked, does she have a written policy on this, or like how do you guys decide like when she will stop to talk and when she won't? And eventually they just sort of shut down. And so
we joke the only time you hear from Warren's like staff is when they're vehemently denying that she's going to run for president. Like that is literally the only time you hear from their staff is to call attention to the fact that she's not running for president.
Yeah.
On the other end of that, is there a member of the delegation who is the most accessible, the most candid, or who you like talking to the most?
Jim Mcgovern is like pretty accessible and is like quotable and is seemingly like upfront, and he was a former congressional staffer, and I feel like former staffers tend to be more like open for some reason, or like they kind of get the game a little bit better, and their like guard is up maybe a little bit less for some reason. But McGovern is good, I find. Like most of the members of our House delegation are accessible. They're just not in any positions of power anymore. Like all in the House. So we don't. They're sort of off doing their own thing. But when I first got down here, it was like Barney Frank was in the middle of Dodd-Frank and healthcare. They were all like sort of in the midst of doing a lot of stuff, and Kerry was still in the Senate. So they were. Kerry would be somewhat accessible, but for 57 seconds or something. I mean, he was like not always accessible, but.
Other questions? If there's nobody else, I'm going to wrap this up. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you, Matt. This was really interesting. Really appreciate your coming.
Yeah, thank you.